hot off the presses. I think it was released a month or two ago. And I was giving this presentation a couple days ago, and one person didn't really realize this was from a video game, because this is how advanced kind of our graphical capabilities have gotten. And so this is sort of the state of the art visually. But if you've ever been through a forest or opened up a textbook on forests, you know that they're tremendously complex in the way that they kind of interact with themselves and the way they behave. And so this is kind of like a cowboy movie in the sense that it's basically a cardboard cutout. The trees don't do anything, they don't grow, there's no real ecosystem there, it's just kind of a facsimile. And so another example of this is what I'll walk you through as 30 years of forests in The Legend of Zelda. And so the first example right there is pretty pixelated back in the 1980s. Going in through the 90s, you start to get 3D geometry, lighting, and things like this. Still essentially just cardboard cutouts. The forests aren't really doing anything, it's just a backdrop. And the most recent Zelda game is kind of still, let me see if I can get this going. Alright, so the most recent game there, they're still sort of in the same place as far as the forest's not really being functional in the way that a biologist would want them to be. And so maybe the best example of what I'm talking about here is a game called Eco, which owes a lot to Minecraft, and hopefully some of you will recognize this. So it's kind of a 3D world where everything is a series of blocks, and the blocks have different properties, so they're simulating water. There's properties of the soil here. And the trees are doing things that we know trees do, which is interacting with the soil, moving water through their bodies, also interacting with the atmosphere. And that kind of simulation is going on in that virtual environment, which maybe doesn't look as sophisticated as what I just showed you. But what I'm getting at here is essentially that we're getting closer to being able to digitize all the things that happen in the biosphere and ecosystems all around the world. We're getting closer to new forms of data, and these forms of data help us ask newer questions, and eventually they might help us solve some of the biggest problems that we're facing this century. So in this talk, I'll just try to demonstrate some of the things that I've been doing in this area, how some of these trends relate to my dissertation, as well as very cool things that people are devoting their careers to elsewhere in the world to help create a system for managing our planet, essentially. So the biggest question would be, how could we simulate the planet? What would that be like to have a fully working model of the Earth, functioning all the time, being fed data from around the world? Actually, we've tried to do this already, and so those of you who would recognize this as Biosphere 2 know that this is sort of the intention behind this facility, to take all the essential components of the Earth system, encapsulate them, and then study sort of the results of manipulating that system. And I encourage you to go visit the facility because it really impresses on you the scope of this problem. As it happens, I've tried to do this too, and I'll show you a quick video of a video game I made a few years ago as an undergrad when I was just getting interested in biology and learning how to program. And I'll be a little embarrassed to show it to you, but you'll also see how difficult this is when you really buckle down and try to do it. So the idea is you're like this robotic rover, and you fly around through water propulsion, and you're watering these seeds, and they grow into these procedurally generated plants. And again, it's kind of like the earlier video games I showed you, where like it looks like there's grass and it looks like there's water, and things are sort of functioning because I'm tricking you, but it doesn't even scratch the surface of the way we think that real ecosystems are kind of operating. And so that was kind of the first moment that I really started to think about these types of things. So the structure of my talk will just be these different portals to the living world, ways that we're merging computational technologies with data from the biosphere and trying to learn more about what's going on, essentially. And so the first one will be having to do with virtual reality. How do we create essentially virtual environments from first principles that try to attack some of what we know about what happens in real ecosystems? And this will be largely just examples of things that I've built getting at this question. After that, I'll talk a little bit about big data and how that relates to people who are trying to digitize different aspects of the biosphere. And then finally, smart sensors, where people are just building networks of machines to continuously monitor natural spaces, monitor temperature and precipitation. We've been doing that for decades, but it's getting more and more sophisticated, and it's going to larger and larger scales. So I started out studying computers because I was interested in learning how to make video games, and I ended up making this plant video game in the context of a class for educating people, so we just had to choose something we wanted to teach someone about. I chose plants because I was getting interested in biology at the time. And it's become kind of my main tool for teaching science, trying to get people interested in these kinds of things, although I'm giving you a talk today because it's good to have multiple approaches. So this was a piece of augmented reality software that I built for an initiative called iDigBio that is going on across North America, funded by the National Science Foundation, to digitize biological specimens. So biological specimens exist in herbaria, tons of insects, taxidermied mammals, and they're being scanned for posterity so that biologists in the future can use this data from organisms that are sometimes hundreds of years old. So I'll quickly show you kind of what this is and what it does. Essentially, you have a mobile phone and your camera pops up, and you can point it at a target, and it registers the target, and then it pops up a 3D model of a particular organism that it knows is sort of associated with that target. And so as it loads, eventually it'll show you a little bug, and then next to that bug are like some little digital interface that has educational material associated with it. And so the novelty here is just that you're kind of showing people what is out there, giving them access to specimens of sometimes very rare organisms that otherwise they couldn't see or touch. Did that go all the way through? Okay. And then more recently, as a Carson scholar, I was working with Biosphere 2 on sort of a similar idea related to augmented reality, but this time instead of looking at organisms, looking at something I'm more interested in at a broader scale, which is how can you kind of teach people about the way ecosystems are structured. And so we targeted a few different ecosystems that are represented within Biosphere 2. So what I'll show you here is an app that sort of works in a similar way, but instead of popping up an organism, it pops up a little toy ecosystem that you can manipulate and play with. And essentially it's supposed to be a tropical rainforest, and there's a couple of different variables that the user can manipulate to kind of observe the effects of temperature and precipitation on the way that a forest will kind of propagate and then persist. And so you can kind of zoom in and check everything out, and it's raining and there's sunlight, and both of those factors, the water and the radiation, affect the way that the plants grow, which is hopefully apparent. And so these are two sort of the main driving factors of the way that forests act across the world, and variation in these factors of precipitation and temperature are kind of the major determinants of what a forest looks like and what it does. And changes in those determinants, precipitation, water, temperature, with climate change are sort of what people are looking at to understand which forests will persist, which ones will fail, and kind of the intermediates between those. And so what I'm trying to tell you is that climate affects plants on a small scale, and at those small scales, we can move up to understand how large groups of plants are going to react to changes in climate. So these two maps here show temperature on top and precipitation on the bottom across the whole world. And these are, again, the two major factors that I was trying to get across in this little toy simulation. And the way that plants are structured kind of are adapted to variation in these factors, and you can see that in the wide variety of leaf types, from conifers and pines to those banana leaves, which exist in very different environments. And so, moving into the next part of the talk, I want to talk about a database that my laboratory group has been assembling of what are essentially observations of plants around the world. It's the largest database of plant occurrences ever assembled, and a plant occurrence is just somebody who observed a plant of a particular species at a particular latitude and longitude. And from that information, we can try to correlate where plants occur based on temperature and precipitation with their historical range. And what we get out are maps that look like this. In red are the occurrences for a particular species, so that's where we know the plant lives. And then by correlating it with these maps of temperature and precipitation, we can create a new map, the green outline there, that's sort of where it would be suitable for that plant to live based on what we know about the temperature and the amount of water it likes to receive. And these kinds of efforts are only newly possible from our ability to collect, compile, and then crunch through with a computer a huge amount of these types of plant data. And also the types of computational models needed to construct these maps of temperature and precipitation at a really fine scale. And so what we can ultimately do is take these maps of where plants like to live and pair them with projections of future climate and extrapolate the ranges of plants into new areas based on changes in, again, precipitation and temperature mainly. And so if you go to forestforecast.org, you can see this happening with our database, where we take a variety of western tree species and animate what is ultimately their decline, unfortunately, into the next roughly 100 years. Almost all species are going to experience range contractions as they are forced to move up mountains where it's going to be as cold as they're used to and as wet as they're used to. And then so finally, this will be sort of the longest portion of my talk and the one most related to my research, related to the kinds of new sensing technologies that are coming about across all scales, from small scales and individual plants up to the entire planet. So ultimately, I'm considering myself more and more just a plant physiologist, and I'm really interested in trees, and especially the way that trees branch. So one thing we're trying to do is take a very complicated tree, like this tree from Costa Rica, and condense it into this network of connected parts. And by measuring all those parts, we can tell quite a lot about what the tree is doing. And a new tool for doing this is called LiDAR, and it's basically a scanning machine. It stands for light detection and ranging, and it's able to iteratively scan an environment. And by bouncing light off surfaces and measuring how long it takes for it to return, you can get a full map of a 3D environment. I'll show you exactly what that looks like very soon. And this is essentially how we're scanning trees and forests to learn about their geometry, which tells us a surprising amount about how they're functioning. So this is ultimately what gets output, is these sort of 3D models of plants. And these are ripe for analysis, and it gives us new data to ask new questions about how ecosystems, whole ecosystems, are behaving, because trees are really dominant within forests. And so I'll show you a few scans that I collected from a cloud forest in Peru. This is in Manu National Park. I believe it's the biggest national park in Peru. So this is an abnormally short forest, so the canopy height's about 30 meters, so quite short trees compared to tropical areas where they're sometimes over 100 meters. And the undergrowth is very dense. There's epiphytes everywhere because the air is so moist. You don't necessarily need to be in the soil to get water. And down there in the bottom right is my scanner. It's kind of obscured by the shadow. But this is basically where it was sitting. And what you get out are these kind of colored blobs, and they're colored by just the distance from the scanner. So the lighter the color gets, the further away it is from where the scan was. That's kind of an outsider's view. If you look at it from the perspective of the scan up into the canopy, you get this kind of jumbled mess. You can kind of pick out the stems of the trees, and it's fun to look at, but ultimately, by having the numbers associated with all these points, we can do really fine-scaled analyses of the way this forest is structured in a way that we couldn't do before. So that's my scanner. And that's what that position would look like. Again, the colors just represent distance from the scanner. There's a lot of speckles there, kind of in the middle of nowhere. There's so much moisture in the air that it's actually bouncing off some of the moisture and returning. So there is stuff there, but it's not necessarily what we're interested in, which is the plants. So this is another national park in Costa Rica, which is a pretty different forest. This is called a dry forest, and dry forests are seasonally dry, so there's many, many deciduous species, which means they lose their leaves at some point every year. And that's what's being shown sort of in the bottom left there, where at one point everything has full leaves, it's a super green forest, but then just before the monsoons, when it's dry, everything, just after the monsoons, everything drops their leaves. And so there's lots of vines and epiphytes and monkeys, and structurally the forest is very different. You can see kind of the looping lianas. And ultimately, my research is moving towards being able to extract individual trees from those types of scans. But going in the other direction, we can look at entire areas of a particular forest and sometimes be able to measure hundreds of trees at one time. So I'll show you a tool that they use for doing this, where essentially they're taking scanners like I have, making them much, much more powerful, putting them on airplanes, and then just flying over the forest and getting a whole digital profile. And I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but in the middle there's a little red blob. And what they were able to do was analyze the data from the scans and say, okay, where's the tallest tree? And then they just kind of colored it there. And it turns out to be the tallest tree that they found anywhere in the world in the tropics. So using this kind of tool, you can automatically extract this type of information. So tallest tree, cool. But if we know the height of all the trees, then we can say a lot about how the forest behaves. It's not just the kind of light that we can see. There's other types of radiation that we can bounce off these forests from other parts of the electromagnetic spectrum. And using these cameras, we can achieve a whole different type of insight. So in the top left, there's an infrared camera, and that sort of gives you some information about how hot or cold everything is. But there's also a set of tools related to the bottom right image, and these are different parts of tree canopies colored in different ways, and what they're detecting is variation in the chemical structure of these different trees, and that's quite a lot of information about the ecology of these trees, and it lets us identify species in a way that we couldn't before very easily. And so we're even learning more about the diversity of different types of plants that live here, whereas everything before was just a bunch of trees. So I did have a chance to go to the Arctic Circle for the first time at a place called Svalbard. I didn't know what Svalbard was really. While we were there, we took a ride to a perennial glacier, which it was summertime, so it was melting, and that's what glaciers do. But talking to the people there, and also a lot of the scientists there, Arctic regions are expected to experience more change relative to other parts of the globe under global warming and things like this. So we were able to scoop some of the melting ice out, and were served whiskey on the rocks. So that was a good way to enjoy a bad situation. And here it is up there on the left. It's north of Norway. It's international territory, actually, so it's jointly administered by mainly the Nords, but also the US and Russians. And so it comes complete with abandoned Russian mining towns, which was fun to visit. What we were doing there was taking some of the aerial technology that I just showed you and trying to fix it onto drones to achieve sort of an intermediate scale of analysis so that you don't have to have a whole airplane to go do this. You could maybe just buy a drone for $1,000 and then have ecologists and hobbyists and all sorts of other people being able to do these kinds of analyses with cheaper equipment all over the world to essentially achieve perfect coverage someday. And so we were scanning these cliffs here and are able to pull out maps of the density of vegetation along these cliffs. And you can do these kinds of surveys in any conceivable ecosystem as long as you have these tools available, and they're increasingly available. And then since about the late 80s through the 90s, we've been launching satellites with these types of cameras into the sky. And now these types of data, high resolution maps with the same types of spectral information from light bouncing off of the surface back into space, these maps are available to essentially any scientist who wants them in many cases, and they're increasingly available. So we're collecting sort of the same types of information at many different scales, from boots on the ground to smaller machines to satellites, and trying to integrate that information all the time. And the prospect of doing this might lead to more knowledge and let us essentially manage the whole planet in tandem at some point. And so hopefully the journey that I sort of took you on was different portals into biology, from a gradient of completely virtual stuff like my silly video games to the real world, which is where we're taking technology and directly digitizing the patterns that we detect and trying to answer new questions based on that. So there's tons of new data available. We don't always know what to do with data, but that's what we need new science for, and it's going to help us ask new questions. And hopefully some of those answers to some of those questions are actually going to be applicable, and maybe we'll have the political will to apply them to problems, because that's ultimately what many of us want to do. So I'll leave you with another dorky video game thing. This is a Pokédex. Hopefully some of you will recognize what a Pokédex is. And on the left there is a grid of all Pokemon that have been invented thus far. And so that's about 800 species of Pokemon, which is minuscule compared to what exists on our planet. And so what the Pokédex knows how to do is you point it at the Pokemon, and it can use some freaky technology to identify it based on a picture, and then it'll give you a full set of facts about what the Pokemon is and does, its life history, what is it like to eat, how big is it on average. And so it's an encyclopedia of life for the world of Pokemon. And we're getting towards being able to do that. These Japanese developers invented in 1994 what looks a lot like a smartphone, complete with all sorts of AI technologies for automatically recognizing various patterns in their biodiversity. And so we're getting closer to being able to do this ourselves, and the prospect of making a fully functional kind of semi-autonomous intelligent encyclopedia of life excites me. So maybe we'll get there before we run out of time. The Pokemon people are working on it already, actually. They have Pokemon Go set up where you can search around in the environment using your smartphone to try to find real Pokemon. Not necessarily as sophisticated as a Pokédex, but it seems like we're going in the right direction. And so that's it. Thank you. One question. This guy was ready.
Okay, two-part question. One, after the infrared camera, you mentioned variable chemical structure. What platform and sensor was that?
So it's called a hyperspectral camera, and it usually.
Okay.
So the one we had a hyperspectral camera in Svalbard, and it was really multispectral. So it has 5 bands.
Okay.
So, okay, the second part.
Do you work with neon?
No, I want to. No, but I want to.
Oh, okay.
That's the answer.
All right.
So neon, as far as I know, is just getting off its feet. I don't know that much about neon, but just reading about what they have available and the infrastructure that they're creating, it's exciting to me as a young ecologist.
Does U of A have a tower out by Biosphere?
I'm not sure.
I think they do.
I wouldn't be surprised. There's a staggering number of sites associated. So for people who don't know, NEON is the National Ecological Observatory Network, and they're thinking about a lot of the things I just mentioned, which is federating a bunch of different ecosystems and a bunch of different data streams, people measuring all sorts of different things about the local environment, but then also unifying all that with cyber infrastructure to make this network of data streams available to scientists and people.
So what are the data streams? I know that you showed the one, where you showed a certain species distribution, and
Yeah.
what's the source of the data source? Is that just all academic, or is there citizen-based stuff like iNaturalist?
So for the maps we showed, we're doing everything at pretty much a regional to a global scale. So a lot of the climatic variables have to be pulled out of climate models. So you have a variety of measurements of like temperature and precipitation around the world, but you don't necessarily have them in Topeka, Kansas exactly. So you have to run a simulation to interpolate between all these different places on the world to get a full map of all these climatic variables.
But what about the species data?
So all of the species data is in our database, and it has a specific latitude and longitude associated with it. And so all we have is point observations of those species.
And who's doing the observing?
Anybody and everybody. So we have pulled data sources from the past over 100 years of people that we can sort of confidently identify have seen the species and have a precise location associated with it. So that's been the main effort, is collating all this old data, because there's tons and tons of old data that is just sitting on a shelf and is not used. And so what I mentioned with the specimen app as well is in Herbaria and in other collections institutions, it's just rotting pretty much. So we have to find a way to digitize it and then federate it.
Going with what he's talking about and with the Pokédex, really, the technology already exists, right? Where machine learning, you can look at a photo and identify, even the species of plant that's in there. Not as accurate as you might want, but everybody's walking around with a smartphone, and you take a picture and you have that exit data on there, like the location and all that. Are you guys looking at that and to help make that your data set more robust?
That would be a dream thing. I feel like I heard someone just mention iNaturalist, but that's like,
Yes.
so that's like the canonical example of using all these dispersed smartphone tools to then collect data in kind of a decentralized way. It just takes a lot of know-how. There's not enough manpower for us to do that, but it would be really cool. Well, so the biggest problem with iNaturalist is someone snaps a photo and is like, oh, I found this bug, what is it? And you have to get a taxonomist to come in and like sort through all this stuff. So you still need experts to do the identification, which is definitely the bottleneck.
Anybody modeling mesquite bosques?
I'm almost certain that a lot of people in the School of Natural Resources and Rangeland Management here in Arizona are doing that. I can't give you specific names, but if you ask around here, I'm sure someone can point you in the right direction. Tons of mesquite modeling. Mesquite encroachment is a huge problem here in the Southwest, and there's a lot of really smart people at Arizona working on it.
So in order to calculate that calorie production, in order to understand our carbon flux, we have to sometimes be able to estimate above ground biomass. And I'm wondering, is this technology able to, do you see it being able to calculate like leaf or branch die-off or heart rot or things like that down to like very minute scales?
So,
Or a much larger scale?
good. So I mentioned there's all these different forms of LiDAR, and it turns out different LiDAR scanners are good at different things. So these ones on the left are super expensive LiDAR scanners, like $80,000 to $100,000, and they're very, very good at measuring above ground biomass within like, say, 100-meter radius, like very, very precise. I can't speak to like the heart rot and the branch die-off. My particular interests are in using these scanners to extract precise 3D models of trees to do a fine-scale analysis of the way they branch. And so certainly I think you could find a way to detect branch die-off at small scales. At larger scales, when you have the aerial data, it definitely gets tricky because your resolution is really limited. And so I think those can still get pretty close to like larger scale biomass estimates, but a fine scale physiological analysis is definitely not as feasible. It depends on the scale of the instrument that you're using, for sure. I'm gonna ask you first.
Similar to that question, I love the idea of LiDAR. So classic census measurements of diameter, are we now so far that we don't need them anymore?
I think we're close, but so for one thing, you definitely need this resolution with the nice scanners, because otherwise your error could be many centimeters, which is pretty significant when you're doing like a census of stems. This is something I'm directly interested in. I'm hoping to try to go to a forest plot this summer and do a manual census, but then also do exactly what you're suggesting, try to fit it with a LiDAR census and just automatically extract the distribution of stem diameters, which would be huge. And so people in forestry have been trying to do that for a while. There just is not enough of this data for people to try it in many different types of forests.
Yeah, even so, it's very difficult to measure diameter of branches with people cutting them down, cutting the trees to measure that. That's really nice.
Yeah.
And you sample on top of the forest, so does the ants form a problem, or are they also?
Yeah, they're a big problem. It sucks. Because so if you're trying to measure a single tree, it's kind of ridiculous how many vines end up on it, especially if it's a big one. And so they're basically obscuring every branch that you might be trying to measure and crawling all over it. And I think people have stayed out of tropical forests with these machines partially because of that, for sure. So the most scanning has been done in like the Northeast and a ton in the UK as well, where there's just no vines to speak of, and also a nice dry season. Because when you try to scan these forests and there's a bunch of leaves, then the leaves actually get in the way of measuring the branches, which sometimes the branches are more informative in some ways. So being able to scan the forest when all the leaves die off is important too.
You sweat them on your committee?
No. But I know Sweatnam. He's helped me in a pinch a couple times.
Well, there was a wonderful presentation, I think it was on Nature, I can't remember, but it was dealing with kind of an overview of aerial LiDAR surveys that they were doing all over the world actually. Is that right? Was that, are you familiar with that?
I'm not sure of that in particular, but more and more of these types of flights are happening, and it can only be a good thing, I think. Any other questions?